Welcome to your lecture on classical India from the time period of 600 BCE to 600 CE. There's two empires that emerged during classical India, the Mauryan and the Gupta. We're going to talk about both of those, but we're also going to be talking a little bit about the uniqueness of India, because what we're going to find in India is different from the other areas that we've been studying. One of the reasons for that is the geography of what we're calling India, especially for the beginning of the course and pretty much up until the modern age. So when we're talking about India, we're discussing a land area that today would be India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan. So we're talking about a very large piece of land. To the south is the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, and north is the Himalaya Mountains. Now, this unique geography, especially with the Himalaya Mountains, is going to make India very different. The Himalaya Mountains is going to protect India as well as cut them off from other things going on in Asia. The territory we're discussing is about a fourth the size of Europe, so it's a very large amount of land that we are calling India for the majority of this course. Because of its geography, the only time all of this territory was united was under the British from the 1800s to the 1900s. So the British are going to relinquish control of this territory in the 1940s after World War II, and they conquer it pretty early on as part of their imperialistic movements. The only other time that India was almost fully united was under the Mauryans and under the Emperor Ashoka. He came close, but he still didn't get as far south as he needed to in order to get the whole subcontinent united. The Indian empires are very different from what we've seen with Persia or Rome, simply because they didn't last for more than a couple hundred years. Because of that, they're not going to have a huge amount of influence on the people as a whole. It's very difficult to create lasting impressions on a group of people or on a geographical area if you're only in charge for a couple hundred years. However, India is unique in the fact that it has maintained a constant cultural unity, and what provides for that unity is Hinduism. So the fact that Hinduism and the caste system and the things that were put in place with that religion is going to unite the people as a whole, but they don't have political unity, and that's something that's very unique to this area. So to start discussing India, we need to consider this group of people called the Aryans. The Aryans are an Indo-European people group, which means that they actually were nomads that came out of probably the Middle East a little bit. They speak a similar language to Hebrew or to any of the other Hindu or Indo-European bases. So your Indo-European languages include English, German, all the Romance languages. So the Aryans are not native Indians at all. So basically, the Aryans were a group of nomadic people who wandered into the subcontinent around 1000 BCE. In the previous time period, you remember that we discussed Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. Those were isolated civilizations along the Indus River. Here, we get a new group of people who migrate into the area. Because they're Indo-European, they're actually lighter skinned. They are going to have different features, and that's going to change the makeup of the ethnicity of what today we would call Indian. They did have some written works, but they're not history. A lot of the written works that we have of the Aryans are religiously based. So it's going to be very similar to things like when we are discussing like the Jewish history or some of the history of the Middle East. A huge amount of our information comes from the Old Testament, because there were history books included in the Old Testament. What the Aryans did was they have religious text where we tried to guess some of the history of the people. The Vedas are one of the earliest forms of Sanskrit, the language of the Aryans, where we actually get some information about them. They did record some history. The Vedas is a series of poems, so it's not just a book. Kind of like how the Bible has different books to it. This is similar to the Vedas. The Vedas has different sections to it. One of them that has a lot of information for us about the migration of the Aryans is the Rig Veda. We know that the Rig Veda was written around 1500 to 1200 BCE, and we have actual archaeological evidence of the Rig Vedas. It's more religious than it is historical, but it did talk about the conquering that the Aryans had to do as they moved into the region. Now, whom they're conquering is a group of people that we call the Dravidians. The Dravidians are the original people that lived on this Indian subcontinent. Today, the further south you get, the more Dravidian you're going to get in language and ethnic characteristics. The further north you are, you're going to see more Aryan languages and more Aryan ethnic characteristics in the people of the region, because the Aryans obviously are not going to get totally all the way to the south. Couple other parts of the Vedas. You have the Brahmanas, which is for about rituals and sacrifices. So it talks about some of the religious ceremony and what exactly the rules are for the different practices within what will become the Hindu religion. Now remember that what the Aryans brought with them, and they created this Hindu religion, is going to be modified as it travels throughout the subcontinent. The Upanishads is kind of like the Book of Revelation. It has some predictions about life and about the future, and about the involvement of the gods in this world, and things of that nature. The Puranas are legends and folk tales, so this would be kind of like your parables. We know that it was written between 500 BCE, 500 CE, which, yes, is 1,000 years, so it's a wide range of stories, and this is where we get a huge amount of our history of the Aryan people. Much like in like Kings or some of the Book of David, or some of the other historical parts of the Old Testament. This is where we're going to get a lot of our information about who was ruling, where they were ruling. However, again, the reality of those rules and the reality of the political control is mixed with information about mythology with the gods and things like that. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana are basically, they tell us about a civil war between two families within the Indian subcontinent. So there's a lot of mythology associated. So when you think about something like the stories about Troy with Achilles and all that kind of stuff, obviously we know that there was some kind of war. We know that there was something going on. We know that there was this figure named Achilles. But in the stories that we have, he was a godlike figure. He had mythical features about him. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana also has information about the gods' involvement in the civil war, and so separating fact from the religious part is difficult to do. One of the most important parts of the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita gives us a huge amount of information about the warrior caste. Remember that in India they have this strict caste system, and so the Bhagavad Gita is where the gods are basically talking to the warriors about their role in society and what the warriors are supposed to do. Politically, we know from all of these written works that there were hundreds of little chiefdoms that would fight each other. The leader was given the title Raja, and the Raja would have a council of elders who would help advise him. And leadership was based on hereditary, so it was a hereditary monarchy, basically, and family lines. So family lines are very, very important in Indian culture. It still is there today. Around 750 BCE, the population increases. Why there was an increase in population? There's probably some type of influx of new products, some type of really good weather patterns that allowed them to have the food resources to create an increased population. When you have more people, you're going to have more complex governments develop. So what they did was they started to create land groups, which basically would be similar to like our states. So they called these Janapadas, and Magadha was the most powerful of these states around 750 BCE. The family that ruled that area were the Mauryan family. So Chandra Gupta is going to rule this small area from 371 to 297 BCE, and basically what he does is he expands. Remember that Alexander the Great got into this region, and Alexander wanted to keep going, but his troops mutinied and said, no, we're not going to go, and so he left. And when he left, there was this power vacuum that Chandragupta took advantage of and basically said that he's going to take over. His successors are going to expand further south, and Ashoka is going to basically control the largest amount of lands in the classical age for this subcontinent. Ashoka Maurya ruled from 268 to 232 BCE, and he basically is going to control a huge portion of India. He uses the same system that his grandfather had already set up. However, something unique to his rule is that he converted to Buddhism. The story is that after this bloody battle in the east, he converted to Buddhism, and Buddhism is a pacifist religion. They're a very peaceful religion. They don't like war. They don't like fighting. Well, it's difficult to be an emperor and expand if you don't want to fight. So something that he does, it's one of the unique things about India, is the placement of the capital cities. They never had like a Rome or a Persepolis or anything like that. They never had like a single capital city, partly because the emperors kept expanding. So each emperor would build their own capital city. For Ashoka, it is Pataliputra. Pataliputra will actually be one of the cities that you guys will research on your city project for the second quarter. So he built this massive capital city, and he centralizes the treasury. And one of his things is that he definitely was a lawmaker. And one of the unique things that he did was he would inscribe these laws on pillars throughout all of the region that he controlled. And you'll do some analysis of those laws within your classwork. Under the Mauryans, family lineages are super important. They paid their bureaucrats very, very well. So in order to ensure loyalty from government workers, they paid them. And that's something that you have to be able to figure out when you are building an empire, is how you're going to ensure loyalty of your government workers. Because the people who could easily overthrow you are going to be the people on the inside. So in order to ensure their loyalty, you have to find a way to do that. And so what the Mauryans did was they paid them very well. They actually had a political kind of handbook on how to rule. They decided to use this concept called Danda Niti, which is basically big stick policy. So in other words, they were kind of authoritative. They were kind of aggressive in their ruling. They didn't necessarily put up with things that regional princes would do. They wanted to make sure that everybody was under their control. They had this theory that weak states should be conquered, and they also used a spy system. So this is very like, KGB, spying on everybody, all that kind of stuff, kind of like what Stalin does, definitely what Hitler does. They're going to spy on all the regional rulers to make sure that they're doing what the central government wants them to do. So people kind of lived in a little bit of fear of the Mauryan rulers. There's all kinds of different ways you can rule the people, and the Mauryans are going to use fear to ensure loyalty as well as money. The goal of the empire under the Mauryans, according to this text, was to give an opportunity for all of the citizens to achieve the four major goals in life. And this is religiously based as well as politically based. So the idea is that the centralized government was to help each individual citizen create artha, which is wealth, kama, which is sensual pleasure, dharma, which is the fulfillment of religious and social duties, and moksha, which is the release from earthly existence. So the government's job was to make this process as easy as possible for the individual citizens of the territory. Socially, India is a very patriarchal society. Men have power over women. At the same time, the men must protect their women. Women's roles were that they must run the household according to the wishes of the men. Women were to be readily available to men at all times. This includes for sensual purposes. If you remember on the previous side, one of the goals of life is to achieve kama, which is a sensual pleasure. So the marriage relationship had that aspect to it, where the women were there to help the men achieve this in their lives. Women very rarely had property rights. Women were not allowed to divorce. It was a very strict patriarchal society. One of the reasons for that is that when you are of the female gender within the Hindu religion, you cannot achieve release from this world, which is the ultimate end for the Hindu religion. You cannot achieve nirvana, basically. Nirvana is the Buddhist word, but you cannot achieve the release of your karmic cycle, basically. And so your hope is that you fulfill your role as a good wife and as a good mother in this world, so that when you reincarnate next time, you will reincarnate as a man, so that you have the opportunity to achieve further parts of the Hindu belief system. The caste system was hereditary distinctions and occupations. The top caste are the Brahmins, which are basically your priest early on. That's not necessarily the case today. The caste system is still, even though it's illegal, it is still alive and well culturally in India. Your Brahmins are your wealthy class. These are the top class within the Indian society. You have your warriors and aristocrats as your second caste. Artisans and merchants are under them. The Shudras is the peasants and serfs, and then there's everybody else. The untouchables are people who are born with some kind of disability, or they have done something horrendous within this life themselves and they've become untouchables, things of that nature. These categories are further split into jati, and jati is basically your job. So you have your caste, and then you have the job that you do within that caste. The goal of this caste system is for everyone to reincarnate into the next caste. And the only way to do that is to fulfill your role within that caste. So even if you are a Shudras, you're a peasant or a serf, you are supposed to be the best peasant you can be, so that in the next life you can reincarnate as some type of artisan. Economically, under the Mauryans, we have an expansion of agriculture and we build massive irrigation systems, which both those things definitely contributed to the increase of the population. They built roads, which is very similar to what the Romans and the Persians were doing, and that's going to encourage trade. And they did regulate what was called guilds, which is basically your association of businessmen. So if you were a blacksmith, then you had government regulations that you had to follow. Here is the extent of the Mauryan Empire. You can see the Indus River and then, of course, the Ganges River. And that pink outline is what is modern-day India. So you can see that what we're talking about is different from the India that we're talking about today. You can also see that the bottom portion of India that Ashoka did not get. And you can see Pataliputra is, of course, along the Ganges River, which would make a lot of sense. The Mauryan Dynasty ends after Ashoka's death. There's an economic decline, which basically just ended the dynasty. The last emperor was assassinated in 184 BCE. Because of the economic issues, the soldiers weren't being paid very well, and the government workers weren't being paid very well. So what ends up happening is all of the Indian subcontinent kind of breaks off into little baby states again. The irony is that between the Mauryan and the Gupta empires, we have a lot of amazing trade going on. The Silk Road is happening. They are getting in monetary. There's evidence of Greek coins coming in, so there is a lot of trade going on, despite the fact that there's not a centralized government. However, they did get invaded from the east a lot, from things like the Afghan tribes and a couple other nomadic groups that were to the east. That prevented them from anyone creating a new empire for quite a long time. The Gupta Empire began under Chandragupta I, and basically what he does is he used diplomacy. He used alliances with aristocratic families, and of course those alliances included marriage relationships. We're going to see some expansion to the south, and then Chandragupta II is going to expand into the west. And one of the things that he does is he starts making them pay tribute to him, and that tribute is basically like a tax. So in other words, hey, you give me money and we'll leave you alone. That's what the tribute system is. And as a result of that, he's going to be able to use that money to regain the loyalty of people around him. The Gupta Empire is very different from the Mauryan Empire because they don't centralize anything. Really, what the Gupta Empire were doing, this is kind of what we would call a tribute empire. They just kind of scared everybody into kind of being loyal to them, but then everybody was still doing what they wanted to do within their own state. Trade cities developed along the Silk Road and, of course, along the coast. And one of the new things that is figured out during the Gupta Empire is the monsoon winds. They were able to figure out that they could follow the monsoon winds down to Africa for 6 months of the year, and then they could come back to India for when the monsoon winds switched direction. And so that's going to be really important to Indian trade throughout the rest of India's history. Oddly enough, during the Gupta dynasty, we end up with a golden age for India. Sanskrit becomes the official language of all of India. However, today there are 26 different languages in India. There is no Indian language. That's not a thing. No one in India speaks Indian. They speak their regional language. Now, they're all very similar, and the most spoken language today is called Hindi. The old Vedas are rewritten and restored, and scholars start to study a lot of the texts that were developed pre-Mauryan, and of course some of the texts that was created during the Mauryan Dynasty. And we see a resurgence of Hinduism. Buddhism basically is going to leave the subcontinent. Buddhism is going to be isolated onto the island of Sri Lanka, and Buddhism along the Silk Road is going to spread into Asia, where it's practiced more widely. The caste system was actually made more strict during this time period, which added stability to a very unstable political system. The emperors just start to lose power. New conquerors show up in the 400s. Lots of different conquerors. We'll discuss this on a separate day when you have a separate assignment just on falls. We see a decline in culture, especially the Buddhist monasteries. Buddhist monasteries are going to be attacked, and they're basically going to disappear from the continent. And new nomad groups are going to come into the region, but they're going to mix in. Hinduism manages to remain in place. This is the extent of the Gupta Empire. You can see that they made use of Pataliputra, which was built by Ashoka, and you can see the Gupta Empire is much smaller than the Mauryan Empire. You can see that they don't control all of the Indus. They don't go as far south as Ashoka's empire did. Once the Gupta Empire falls, we basically have 500 years where nothing's happening in India. It's regional states. There's no centralization for India, but and they kind of get conquered a lot from the north, but each of the regional kingdoms are ruling themselves and doing their own thing. Despite that, their culture remains the same in regards to religion. However, the practice of Hinduism is different in every single region, and that's the kind of stuff that we will have already discussed in your religion assignments.